Hello everybody, and welcome to what is my new office. Some people call them studios, but it's not really a studio, is it? It's a bedroom in my new house, which is not finished yet. When it is finished, I'll show you around, but I'm very happy with it so far. This green that you can see behind me, that's pine needle from Dulux, if you're interested. Very nice dark green. Anyway, today what I thought I'd do is talk through this, my new Lumix S5. This one's not a loaner, this is mine. It came in the post yesterday, along with this 85mm f1.8, which was released yesterday. This isn't mine, this is a loan lens, but I'm looking forward to trying it out in the mountains next week when Wales comes out of lockdown. Until then, what I thought I'd do is talk through the settings I intend to use on my S5 for photography. I've done a few videos like this where I've talked about camera settings, but consider this the 2020 version because, like everything, over time preferences and workflows and things change. So this is how I'm going to set up this camera, and it may differ to have talked about setting up cameras in the past. But nevertheless, let's talk. Is that really boring? I don't know. It might be quite boring to have a video just about camera settings, but it's lockdown, so let's have a go. Right, so with this S5, I intend to live pretty much exclusively within two custom modes, C1 and C2. And I've got C1 set up for photography, and C2 is set up for video. And I will quickly run through C2 in a minute, but I'm imagining that most of you are more interested in the photography settings. I use more interested very loosely. Sorry, it's still quite dusty in here. I probably should have cleaned it before doing this, but never mind. If you've never used custom settings, basically it enables you to group together a load of settings that you use frequently and just have them all in one mode ready to go. So every time I turn the dial to C1, I've got a load of settings that I've chosen ahead of time already selected, and that's what I'm going to run through today. So those settings that I have currently set up in C1 is aperture priority mode. I shoot 95% of the time in aperture priority because aperture normally is my priority. In terms of white balance, I go for auto white balance, for photography at least, not for video. Auto white balance in video is horrific because basically you're recording a clip and the camera is constantly changing the white balance, which is a nightmare to try and correct in post-production. With photography though, cameras do a pretty good job of changing the white balance to reflect the scene, and that's never changed in the middle of a shot. So it's never really a problem to have auto white balance, particularly if you shoot in RAW, because if you don't like what the camera has done with the white balance, then you can change that fairly easily in post. So yeah, auto white balance all the way in photography. In terms of picture profiles, I go for standard, which is not interesting at all, to be honest. I do make some changes to the standard profile with Lumix cameras though. I take the contrast down by 1, I take the saturation down by 1, and I take the sharpness down by 1. And that's largely because the presets that I typically use are quite strong. They, the effect of them is, yeah, pretty strong. So I like my raw files to be really raw, basically. Therefore, I take those elements down just a tiny bit. Capture type, RAW, as I said, I capture RAW to both cards in the dual card slots. I'm talking like I already do this. I've not really used this camera yet, but that's my intention, as I have with all my other cameras to date that have got dual card slots. Autofocus, I usually go for autofocus single or AFS. And because of the joystick on this camera, and indeed the joystick on my G9, I don't know why I'm pointing that way, I'm filming on the G9. But the joysticks are fantastic, so I basically always use one area and I can set the joystick to run really fast, and it basically means I can change wherever I'm focusing very quickly, and I can be absolutely sure that my camera is focusing on what I want it to focus on, as opposed to giving the camera the preference of what it focuses on. Now, if you're like a wildlife photographer or something, this might not be the best setting for you, but for me and the stuff I shoot, I find that this works pretty well. Now, in the past, I've talked a little bit about how I use back button focusing, which is basically using a button on the back of the camera to focus so that you don't need to rely on the shutter half press to focus, which can be a bit of a nightmare, particularly if you're shooting in, say, cold weather and you're wearing gloves. It's not always all that reliable. So back button focusing, and there's plenty of other reasons to do it, has always been a bit of a staple for me. However, I have changed things a little bit on this camera, primarily because I also shoot video alongside stills. And the thing that I've changed is that I've got an AF lock now, basically. And what that means is that when I press the button on the back of the camera that says AF on, it locks the focus. So where previously I'd only ever be focusing while I was pressing the button, now all I have to do is press the button, I can release it, and the focus will stay locked on whatever I focused on. Now that's really handy for things like video, whereby if I'm recording out on my own and I want to go and sit on a rock and record something, I can just focus on the rock, leave my camera, go and sit on the rock, record it, come back, knowing that the camera will stay focused on the rock, and I don't have to worry about manual focus and making sure that it's absolutely pin sharp. The camera will do a great job. But I've also found it pretty good in lots of still situations. So let's say, for example, I'm on top of a hill and I'm looking down into a valley and I want to focus on a particular area of road and I'm just waiting for a car to come past, then I can focus on that area of road, and when the focus is locked, I know that I don't have to worry about focus at all. I know it's done and I can just concentrate on my composition and making sure that I get the shot without worrying about whether I'm going to miss the focus or not. So I've found that focus lock actually has been a really good fit for me over the past 6 months or so, and therefore I'm going to bring it forward to the S5. How are we doing? Are you bored yet? Hopefully not. If you're still here, I appreciate it. Metering, multi, I always use multi-metering. I never really see a cause to use any of the other modes, because if I'm in like a really high contrast scene, for example, I'll just bracket rather than change the metering. So yeah, that's how I go about that. I also have a minimum shutter speed set up in this mode, and my minimum shutter speed is set to a 50th of a second. Now, as many of you all know, I despise using tripods, and when I'm shooting handheld, I know that I can always get sharp results at a 50th of a second or quicker, regardless of the focal length, because of the amazing stabilization in these cameras and in some of the longer focal length lenses. So yeah, 50th of a second, I'm always confident I can get a sharp result. Basically what it means is that the camera will always select a 50th of a second or faster, and it'll just adjust the ISO to make sure the exposure stays good. Now, if I'm shooting somewhere where, for example, it's completely pitch black and I need a shutter speed of 20 seconds, then I can just go into shutter priority or manual mode and I can make those changes there. But for the most part, I'm going to want to be shooting a 50th of a second or faster, and having a minimum shutter speed allows me to do that, and I don't have to worry too much about the ISO in this camera because it's full frame and it's not particularly high resolution, 24 megapixels I think, and therefore this camera is pretty good in low light. That said, I do use auto ISO, and I've got the maximum ISO set to 6400. And if I'm in settings where I think 6400 is a little bit high, I've got a couple of options. So this back dial I have set to exposure compensation. So if I take down the exposure a little bit, obviously the image will darken, but that will bring down the ISO. The other option I've got, of course, being in aperture priority mode, is this front dial is set to change aperture. So I can widen the aperture to let more light in, and therefore in turn probably bring down the ISO or quicken the shutter speed. Sometimes maybe a mix of both. It depends how dark it is. What else? Oh yeah, I have this button on the front of the camera set to aperture effect, whatever it's called. I think it's called aperture effect. Basically, it shows you the depth of field that you've got with your current aperture settings. And that is sometimes quite useful to check that everything you want in focus is in focus. And the only other thing that I can think of is I've got the bin button, basically the delete button in playback mode. I've got that set to bring up bracketing in record mode. So as I said, I always use multi-metering, but if I'm in scenes with really, really high contrast, then I can just press this button and make sure that I bracket for 3 or 5 or 7 different exposures, normally one stop apart. It's my preference, but yeah, having quick access to bracketing has always been something I've kept on all my cameras, and I had a little dial set on my G9, which is not over there, it's there to do exactly the same thing. There's no dial on the S5, but I found a button to do it anyway. And lastly, these 3 buttons on the top for white balance, ISO, and exposure compensation, I love the fact that those buttons were there. Certainly I did when I first got my G9 nearly 3 years ago now. But to be honest, because of the way I've set the camera up, I don't have any use for these. Like exposure compensation, I've got the back dial set up to do that. ISO, I'm on auto ISO, and white balance, I'm on auto white balance. So I very rarely need these 3 buttons. So I think in time, I'll probably find different functions to assign to those buttons as well. But for the meantime, that's a relatively quick, hopefully, roundup of my settings. I'll quickly run through the video ones, but there's a good chance you couldn't care less about the video ones. So if you're not interested, thank you very much for watching this, and thank you so much to everyone who's bought a print so far. There's 1 week to go in the print sale, and I've got my new printer set up here, my A2 printer, and I've started printing your orders already. Can't wait to ship them. They'll start shipping on the 16th. But yeah, there's 1 week to go in the biggest print sale I'll ever do. Thank you so much for your support. And if you've been thinking of getting a print from me for a while, this is, I promise, undoubtedly the best time there will ever be to do it. Maybe not ever, because hopefully I'll get more really good images in future. But this is the cheapest my prints will ever be. So yeah, to those of you who are only interested in the photo stuff, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next week. If you're interested in the video stuff though, my C2 mode, then let me run through that stuff quickly as well. I have got white balance set to daylight, normally because I'm out in daylight. Occasionally I change that to cloudy. I say occasionally, I mean it's mostly cloudy in Wales, but maybe I'll just have it set to cloudy from now on. I'm shooting in Vlog. I've got very little experience of editing log footage, so we'll see how that goes. I'm shooting in 4K, 25p, and just 8-bit. I probably will use 10-bit in future, but I'm just a bit scared of it, so I'm just using 8-bit for the time being. Again, I'm AFS mode for focus, but I'm face priority, face recognition, eye recognition, whatever it's called. I've got that set for my focus mode, because usually I'm sort of in the frame in my videos. I apologise for that. Auto ISO again, and shutter speed, well, I'm in shutter priority mode, so I can just adjust that as I wish. Other than that, everything is pretty much the same as with stills, where applicable. So yeah, those are my settings. Hopefully that was in some way, oh, just start recording. Hopefully that was in some way interesting, and I look forward to testing this lens and this lens, which is the Sigma 85 1.4. It's basically the equivalent of the Lumix. It's not equivalent, this is 1.8, this is 1.4, but look how much bigger it has to be for a slightly wider aperture. Massive. Anyway, I'll test these lenses, portrait lenses basically, in the mountains, taking photos of landscapes and stuff next week. Bit of a weird one, but hopefully that'll be interesting. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you then.